Gilded Salt, a Jamaican story of love, loss, and restoration. Chapter 1. The Wedding. The humid air of Hope Gardens was thick with the scent of 1,000 blooming lilies and the expensive perfume of 500 guests. It was the kind of wedding people in Kingston talk about for decades, the kind that makes the front page of the social scales. I stood under a canopy of white orchids, my hand trembling slightly in Anthony's firm, warm grip. He looked like a god in his tailored linen suit, dark, sharp-featured, and radiating the kind of quiet power that makes people clear a path without being asked. When he looked at me, his eyes weren't just admiring, they were consuming. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever bought," he whispered as the priest droned on about holy matrimony. I chuckled, thinking it was a joke, a slip of the tongue from a man who spent his days acquiring real estate and tech firms. I didn't see the truth hiding in plain sight behind his designer shade. The reception was a blur of champagne towers and the thumping bass of a reggae fusion band. My mother, dressed in her best Sunday hat despite the Saturday heat, pulled me aside. Her eyes were wet with a mixture of pride and a strange flickering anxiety I didn't understand yet. "Tia, girl," she whispered, smoothing the lace on my shoulder. "You move up in the world now. Just remember who you are when the music stops, eh?" "Mama, I'm still Tia," I laughed, sipping my drink. "I'm just Tia with a bigger house." "Wealth is a loud thing, baby. It drowned out the small voices." I brushed her off. I was 26, a rising star at my marketing firm, and I had just married the most eligible bachelor in the parish. I felt invincible. The silence started in the car. The party was still roaring behind us at the gardens, but the moment the heavy door of Anthony's Mercedes-Benz thudded shut, the world went mute. The leather smelled of newness and cold ambition. Anthony didn't reach for my hand. He didn't tell me I looked beautiful again. He just loosened his tie and stared at the road ahead, his jaw set like he was calculating a closing cost. "That was a beautiful ceremony," I said, trying to bridge the sudden gap. "Everyone seemed so happy." "The catering was 5 minutes late with the lobster," he said, his voice flat. "I'll be clawing back 10% of their fee tomorrow." "Oh, I didn't even notice." "That's because you don't have to notice things anymore, Tia. That's my job." He reached over then, but he didn't stroke my cheek. He tucked a stray hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering a second too long, pressing slightly against my temple. "From now on," he continued, "you just focus on me. On us. I don't want you distracted by the noise of the world. You're a sterling now. We have a standard to keep." I looked out the window as we climbed the winding roads toward the hills of Jack's Hill. The city lights of Kingston sprawled out below us like fallen jewels. But as we ascended, the air grew thinner, and the houses grew further apart. When we reached the gates of our new home, a fortress of glass and steel, the security guard saluted. Anthony didn't acknowledge him. He just drove through. Inside the house, the silence was even heavier. It was a decorated silence, marbled floors, high ceilings, and art that cost more than my childhood home, but it felt hollow. I went to the bedroom to take off my dress, expecting him to follow, expecting the fire of a wedding night. Instead, I heard the click of his office door. I sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, still draped in layers of tulle and silk, listening to the hum of the air conditioning. I realized I was waiting for permission to breathe. The first night of my marriage wasn't spent in his arms. It was spent realizing that in this house, the only voice that mattered was the one that stayed silent until it had something to demand. Chapter 2. The Gilded Nursery. The transition from power couple to protected asset happened so slowly I didn't feel the shackles tighten until the metal was cold against my skin. Shane arrived on a Tuesday in July, a tiny, screaming miracle with Anthony's stubborn chin and my grandmother's wide, searching eyes. For those first few weeks, the house in Jack's Hill felt alive. The sterile silence was replaced by the rhythmic shush-shush of my slippers on the marble and the soft scent of baby powder. I was exhausted, but I was happy. I was ready to go back to work, to the spreadsheets, the client pitches, the loud, chaotic energy of the agency. I missed the Tia who drank too much coffee and argued about brand positioning. "I called HR today, babe," I said one evening, nursing Shane by the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the glowing embers of the Kingston lights. "They're holding my VP position until next month. I think I'll start back 3 days a week." Anthony was pouring a glass of aged rum, the ice clinking like a gavel against the crystal. He didn't turn around. "No," he said. The word was so small, yet it filled the entire room. What do you mean, no? I felt a prickle of heat crawl up my neck. We discussed this. My career is. Your career was a hobby, Tia. A way to pass the time until you had a real purpose. He finally turned, his face unreadable in the dim light. Look at him. Look at our son. You think some mid-level marketing firm is more important than raising a sterling heir? It's not about importance, Anthony. It's about me. I need to work. I need my own mind. He walked over and knelt beside the nursing chair. He didn't touch me. He touched Shane's tiny hand. I've already handled it. I spoke to your boss this morning. I told him you've decided to retire to focus on the family. I've settled your severance. It's done. My heart hammered against my ribs. You did what? Without asking me? I am protecting you, he said, his voice dropping to that terrifyingly calm register he used during hostile takeovers. The world out there is loud and ugly. Here you have everything. You have the staff, the security, the comfort. Why would you want to leave paradise to slave for a paycheck I can earn in an hour? It's my money, Anthony. It's my life. He stood up, towering over me, the shadow of his frame blotting out the city lights. Everything you have is ours, and ours is managed by me. You're tired, Tia. The hormones are making you irrational. Go to sleep. He walked out, clicking the light off as he went, leaving me in the dark with a hungry baby and a sudden suffocating realization. The door to the world had just been locked from the outside. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in psychological pruning. Anthony began by optimizing my life. My car, the little sporty hatchback I'd bought with my first big bonus, was sold. Too dangerous for a mother, he claimed. In its place sat a tank-like black SUV that only his driver Winston was allowed to operate. Then came the restructuring of my social circle. I don't think you should see Sash today, he'd say over a breakfast I barely tasted. Why? She's my best friend. She's a gossip, Tia, and she's bitter. She'll fill your head with nonsense about independence because she can't find a man to take care of her. We have a reputation to uphold. Stay home. Invite the decorator over. Fix that guest wing. Slowly, the invitations stopped. My phone, once a hive of activity, became a paperweight. When I did manage to sneak a call to my mother, she sounded distant, her voice hushed. Anthony, call your father, she told me one afternoon. He say you stressed. He say you need quiet. He say we shouldn't bother you too much while the baby young. Mama, I'm not stressed. I'm lonely. I'm trapped. Hush, Tia, a man like Anthony. He provide. You have a good pick-me. Don't throw away gold looking for silver. Even my own blood was being colonized by his narrative. I started to wonder if I was the problem. Maybe I was ungrateful. Maybe this was what being a woman of stature meant in Jamaica, to be a beautiful, silent ghost in a mountaintop mansion. By Shane's 6-month birthday, I stopped wearing makeup. What was the point? The only person who saw me was Anthony, and he only looked at me to find faults. You're letting yourself go, he remarked one night, eyeing the yoga pants I'd lived in for 3 days. A sterling woman should be sharp, precise. You look soft. I'm a mother, Anthony. I'm tired. I hire a nanny so you aren't tired, Tia. Use her. Go to the spa. Get your hair done. I have a dinner with the Minister of Finance on Friday. I need you to look like you belong on my arm, not like you're the help. I spent the next day at the salon, sitting under the dryer for hours. I felt like a doll being repainted. I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger. The sharp, ambitious girl from the agency was gone. In her place was a polished, hollowed-out version of a woman, dressed in silk and sadness. I was learning the most painful lesson of all. In Anthony's world, love wasn't a feeling. It was a transaction, and I had already been bought and paid for. Chapter 3. The Weight of the Silence. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It had grown teeth. It chewed at the edges of my mind from the moment Anthony left for his strategy sessions at 7 in the morning until he returned, smelling of expensive scotch and the cold air of boardroom power, long after Shane and I had retreated to our separate corners of the mansion. Wealth, I realized, was the perfect camouflage for neglect. Anthony's business empire was expanding. He was no longer just a real estate mogul. He was a titan of industry, his face plastered on the business lift-outs of the Gleaner. He spent his weekends on golf courses in Montego Bay with men who laughed like thunder and saw women as either accessories or liabilities. Why wasn't I invited to the gala at the Spanish court, Anthony? I asked one Saturday morning. I was stirring a cup of tea that had gone cold, my fingers tracing the gold rim of the porcelain, another gift he'd bought to replace my chipped favorite mug from college. He didn't look up from his financial reports. It was a stag affair, Tia. Business. You wouldn't have enjoyed the talk of interest rates and logistics. I have an MBA, Anthony. I literally spent 5 years talking about interest rates and logistics. He finally looked at me, but his eyes were like two polished stones. That was another life. You have a different portfolio now. You manage the household. You manage Shane. That is your contribution to this partnership. I'm not a partner. The words burst out of me, sharp and jagged. I'm a ghost. You don't talk to me. You don't look at me unless you're checking to see if my dress is pressed. You spend more time with your associates than you do with your own son. Anthony set the paper down with a slow, deliberate precision that made my blood run cold. He stood up and walked toward me, his shadow stretching across the breakfast nook. I am building a legacy, he said, his voice a low, dangerous hum. I am ensuring that Shane never has to want for anything. I am providing a life that 99% of this island would kill for. And you sit here, in a $10 million house, complaining about attention, like a needy schoolgirl. He leaned in closer, the scent of his cologne, something sharp and metallic, filling my senses. Do you know what people say about you, Tia? They say you're lucky. They say you hit the jackpot. Don't make them start saying you've gone mad with it. It would be a shame if I had to tell your mother you're struggling. Mentally. Later that afternoon, while Millicent had Shane in the garden, I found myself in the master suite. Anthony had left his blazer draped over the armchair, a rare slip in his usual armor of perfection. As I went to hang it up, a small embossed slip of paper fell from the inner pocket. It was a receipt from a high-end jeweler in New Kingston. My breath hitched. 1 diamond tennis bracelet, 18K white gold, 5 carats. The date on the receipt was 2 weeks ago. My heart, which had felt like a lead weight for months, gave a frantic, hopeful thump. Was this it? Was this his way of apologizing for the coldness? Perhaps the gala he'd excluded me from had been a ruse, and he was waiting for a special moment to bridge the distance between us. I tucked the receipt back into the pocket, my mind racing. I waited that night. I waited the next. I wore the silk robe he liked. I made sure the house was a sanctuary of quiet when he walked through the door. But the gift never came. A week passed, then 2. The hope turned into a slow-moving poison. I began to watch him more closely, looking for signs of a hidden life. If the bracelet wasn't for me, who was it for? Was there someone else, someone who didn't complain, someone who still had the light in her eyes that I had lost? The betrayal wasn't just the thought of another woman. It was the realization that I didn't even matter enough to be lied to. The receipt sat in his pocket like a taunt, a symbol of a reward I wasn't worthy of, or a secret I wasn't supposed to know. I was just there. A fixture. A ghost in silk haunting a house where diamonds were bought for people who hadn't yet been broken. He began to fill the house with people who weren't mine. Dinner parties became a regular occurrence, but I was the caterer, not the guest. Anthony would invite his friends, men with heavy gold watches and their much younger, surgically tightened wives. Tia, tell them about the new nursery wing, Anthony would command, his hand resting on my shoulder. His grip was always a fraction too tight, a physical reminder of who held the reins. I would recite the facts, the Italian wallpaper, the imported crib, the climate-controlled air. The wives would nod, their eyes pitying or envious. I couldn't tell which. They talked about shopping trips to Miami and the best Botox doctors in New Kingston. When I tried to steer the conversation toward the recent elections or the shift in the global markets, Anthony would laugh, a patronizing, indulgent sound. My Tia, he'd say to the table, always trying to keep her brain sharp. It's adorable, isn't it? But darling, let the men handle the heavy lifting. Why don't you go check if the dessert is ready? I would walk into the kitchen, my face burning, and lean against the cold industrial fridge. I could hear their laughter from the dining room. I was the punchline. I was the little wife who didn't know her place. I looked at my bare wrist, thinking of the diamond bracelet hidden somewhere in his study. I realized then that in Anthony's world, beauty and jewelry weren't expressions of love. They were payments for compliance. And clearly, I hadn't earned mine yet. I started to lose my voice. Literally. Sometimes days would go by where the only person I spoke to was the nanny, Millicent. But even Millicent looked at me with a guarded expression. Anthony paid her salary, a generous one, and she knew where her loyalty had to lie. "Miss Tia, you eat some food, eh?" she'd say, watching me pick at a salad. "You getting thin like a reed. Mr. Anthony won't like that." Everything was framed through what Anthony would like. I began to spend hours in the bathtub, the water as hot as I could stand it, trying to feel something, anything, other than the crushing weight of the silence. I would look at Shane playing on the rug, and a terrifying thought would creep into my mind. He doesn't even know who I am. He only knows the woman who holds him and cries. Anthony was winning. He had retired my career, refined my friends, and now he was erasing my spirit. I was becoming a decorative feature of the Sterling estate, as silent and stationary as the statues in the garden. The architect's inventory, a lost chapter. The leather in my office smelled of success, a blend of expensive hide, mahogany oil, and the crisp ozone scent of the air purifier. It was the smell of a man who had conquered the chaos of the Kingston streets and built a fortress above them. I leaned back in my chair, swirling a glass of 25-year-old Appleton estate. From this height in Jack's Hill, the city looked like a circuit board, and I was the one soldering the connections. I heard the faint, distant sound of Shane crying 2 floors away. I frowned. Tia should have that under control, I thought. That is what I paid the nanny for. That is why I freed her from the office. People didn't understand the weight of being a provider. They saw the cars and the country club memberships, but they didn't see the mental tax of maintaining an empire. Tia certainly didn't. Lately, she had become difficult. Not loud, she didn't have the spirit for that anymore, but heavy. She moved through the house like a damp fog, chilling the air of my success. I had done everything right. I had rescued her from that dead-end marketing firm where men with half my intellect stared at her legs. I had given her a name that opened every door in Jamaica. I had turned her into a Sterling. "She doesn't appreciate the silence," I murmured to the empty room. I remembered the way she used to look. Vibrant, yes, but unpolished. I had refined her. I had curated her wardrobe, thinned out her friends who were nothing but anchors, dragging her back to mediocrity, and given her the ultimate status, motherhood without the struggle. And yet she looked at me with those vacant, accusing eyes. As if my ambition were a crime. As if the gold cage I built for her wasn't better than the dirt she'd come from. I pulled up my private banking app. The numbers were beautiful, symmetrical. I had just closed the Portmore development deal, and the commission alone could buy a fleet of the cars Tia used to drive. I thought about the diamond bracelet sitting in my safe. I hadn't given it to her yet. She didn't deserve it. She hadn't smiled properly in weeks, and I wasn't in the business of rewarding bad behavior. I would wait until she performed better at the upcoming gala. A wife was like a high-end property. She required maintenance, yes, but she also had to yield a return on investment. She had to represent the brand. Anthony? Her voice had drifted into my thoughts earlier that day. She had asked for more. More what? More talk? More time? I gave her the most precious thing a man like me had. My protection. In a country that could be as volatile as a tropical storm, I was her anchor. If she felt erased, it was only because she was finally being integrated into something greater than herself. I checked my watch. 10 p.m. She would be in bed by now, probably pretending to sleep so she wouldn't have to acknowledge my late return. She didn't realize that I preferred the silence. It allowed me to think. It allowed me to build. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out toward the south. The horizon was black, the sea a hidden monster in the dark. I felt a flicker of something. Not guilt, I didn't possess the hardware for that, but a slight annoyance. There was a crack in the perfection of my life, a soft spot in the foundation. Tia was the only part of my world I couldn't quite automate. I'll talk to her mother tomorrow, I decided, sipping the last of the rum. The girl needs a hobby, or perhaps another child, something to keep her hands busy so her mind stops wandering. I felt satisfied with the solution. I was a man of action, an architect of destiny. I'd built a world where everything had its place, and Tia's place was exactly where I had put her. I turned off the office light, the click echoing in the vast, expensive emptiness of the house. I had no idea that while I was calculating the cost of her maintenance, she was already calculating the cost of her escape. I went to bed confident in my ownership, never realizing that the one thing I couldn't buy was the one thing I had already destroyed. Chapter 4. The mirror breaks. The mirrors in the Sterling mansion were everywhere, floor-to-ceiling glass in the foyer, gilded Victorian frames in the hallways, and the vast, cruel expanse of the master's suite. Anthony liked to see himself reflected in his success. I, however, had started to avoid them. When I did catch a glimpse, I didn't see the woman who had graduated top of her class at UWI. I saw a hollowed-out sculpture, a Stepford version of a Jamaican wife, polished until she was transparent. The psychological warfare had moved from subtle dismissal to active erosion. Anthony began to correct me in front of Shane, who was now a toddler, beginning to mimic the world around him. "No, Shane," Anthony would say, his voice tight with fake patience when the boy reached for me. "Mummy is tired today. Mummy is always tired, isn't she? Come to Daddy. Daddy has the strength." He was stealing the light in my son's eyes, teaching him that I was a fragile, failing thing. One Tuesday evening, the heat in Kingston was stifling, even with the central air humming its expensive tune. Anthony came home later than usual, the smell of expensive gin and new money clinging to his skin like a second suit. "We're hosting the board members of the Kingston Harbor project on Friday," he announced, tossing his keys onto the marble console. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "I want you to wear the emerald dress. And for God's sake, Tia, try to have a conversation that doesn't involve the weather or the nanny's problems." "I don't want to host, Anthony," I said softly. My voice felt like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "I'm not feeling well. My head, it's been pounding for days." He stopped. He didn't come over to touch my forehead. He didn't ask if I needed a doctor. He simply looked at me with a cold, clinical disgust. "You're not feeling well because you do nothing, Tia. Stagnant water breathes mosquitoes. You sit in this house eating my food, spending my money, and you have the audacity to be tired? Do you have any idea how hard I work to keep this roof over your head?" "I never asked for this roof," I screamed. The sound shocked me. It was the first time I'd raised my voice in a year. "I had a roof. I had a life. You took it. You retired me like an old horse and put me in a stable." Anthony didn't flinch. He walked toward me, his pace slow and predatory. He didn't hit me. Anthony was too refined for bruises that could be seen, but he leaned in until his breath was hot against my ear. "You had a life of middle management mediocrity," he hissed. "I gave you a kingdom, and if you can't play the part of the queen, I'll find someone who can. You think you're irreplaceable? Look in the mirror, Tia. You're fading. You're a ghost, and nobody remembers a ghost once the lights come on." He walked away, leaving me trembling in the hallway. I looked at the mirror then. He was right. I was translucent. I could see the wallpaper through my own skin. The friends Anthony surrounded himself with were his mirrors, men who valued women only as extensions of their own ego. I saw him one night at the club he frequented, a place I'd practically had to beg the driver to take me to under the guise of surprising my husband. I watched through the glass partition of the VIP lounge. Anthony was surrounded by 3 men and 2 women, women who looked like the old me, sharp, laughing, professional. He was leaning in, showing them something on his phone, his face lit with a genuine warmth I hadn't seen in 3 years. He wasn't cheating in the way people usually meant. He was cheating on my soul. He was giving his respect, his intellect, and his joy to strangers, while saving only his contempt for the woman who carried his name and his child. I realized then that there was no coming back. I had spent 3 years trying to fill a vessel that was intentionally cracked. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a void he could fill with his own greatness. The drive back to Jack's Hill was a blur. I sat in the back of the SUV watching the lights of Kingston flicker and fade as we climbed higher. The higher we went, the more the air felt like it was being sucked out of the cabin. That night, I went into Shane's room. He was sleeping, his little chest rising and falling in perfect, innocent rhythm. I sat on the floor by his crib and wept, not the loud, sobbing grief of a woman who can be comforted, but the silent, rhythmic leaking of a woman who has run out of hope. I looked at the photos on the dresser, the wedding, the baptism. In every one, Anthony was looking at the camera, and I was looking at Anthony. I had made him my son, and in doing so, I had let myself be burnt to ash. "I'm sorry, Shane," I whispered. "I'm so sorry I let him kill the woman who was supposed to protect you." The plan didn't form all at once. It drifted in like the mist over the hills, cold, white, and final. If I stayed, Shane would grow up to be Anthony. He would learn that women are things to be acquired and then discarded. He would learn that love is a weapon. I couldn't let him become the man who destroyed me, and I couldn't leave him behind to be raised by a monster in a silk tie. Chapter 5. The Leap. The morning was too bright. It was a cruel, vibrant Jamaican morning where the bougainvillea bled pink against the white stone walls and the blue mountains stood tall and indifferent in the distance. Anthony had left before dawn. No word, just the lingering scent of his cologne and a sense of relief that followed the closing of the heavy mahogany front door. I moved through the house like a sleeper. I didn't pack a suitcase. I didn't take the jewelry. I took only Shane. "We're going for a drive, baby," I whispered. He was 2 years old now, full of why and where, mummy. I didn't have the heart to tell him the truth. I bypassed the driver. For the first time in years, I took the keys to the SUV myself. Winston started to protest, but I looked at him with a gaze so hollowed out and dead that he stepped back. Maybe he saw the ghost finally leaving the machine. The drive to St. Elizabeth felt like a journey out of a dream. As I left the manicured prison of Jack's Hill and the smog of Kingston, the landscape began to change. The lush green gave way to the rugged, dry beauty of the south. The lignum vitae trees stood stubborn against the heat, and the air began to smell of salt and pimento. I drove for hours. My mind was a whirlwind of memories, flickering like a broken film reel. Anthony's first no. The way he looked at his watch while I was in labor, the coldness of the marble floors, the way my voice had withered until I couldn't even recognize my own laugh. "Mummy, look, cow!" Shane pointed at the window, his face pressed against the glass. My heart broke. It didn't just break, it shattered into a million jagged pieces that tore at my insides. He was so beautiful. He was so innocent. But I saw the shadow of Anthony in the set of his jaw, and I knew that in this world, in that house, that shadow would grow until it eclipsed everything soft in him. I couldn't leave him to the man who had turned me into a shadow. I couldn't let Anthony win. Lover's Leap. The name felt like a taunt. I parked the car in the gravel lot. The wind here was different. It didn't just blow, it howled, carrying the spray of the Caribbean Sea 1,700 feet below. I unbuckled Shane and held him against my hip. He was heavy, a solid, warm weight that felt like the only real thing in a world of illusions. I walked past the lighthouse, past the tourists who didn't see the woman with the dead eyes, and moved toward the edge of the cliff. The view was breathtaking. The coastline stretched out in a curve of white foam and deep bruised purple water. It was the edge of the world. "Look at the sea, Shane," I whispered. My voice was finally steady. The trembling had stopped the moment I saw the horizon. "Big water, mummy?" he chirped, clinging to my neck. I looked down. The waves were crashing against the jagged rocks below, a rhythmic, violent pulse. It looked like a door. It looked like the only exit left in a house with no windows. I thought of Anthony. At this moment, he was probably in a meeting, leaning back in his leather chair, deciding the fate of 1,000 workers with a flick of his pen. He would come home to a quiet house. He would be angry first, angry that his asset had gone missing. Then he would be embarrassed. He would worry about the scandal. He would never understand that he had pushed me to this precipice one no at a time. "You can't control this, Anthony," I whispered to the wind. "You can't retire me from this." The turmoil in my chest peaked, a roar of grief and love so intense it felt like it would consume me before the fall did. I kissed the top of Shane's head. He smelt like sun and home. "I love you more than the sky," I said, my voice breaking. "And I'm taking us home." The wind caught my hair, pulling it back from my face. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like Tia. Not a wife, not a trophy, not a ghost. I felt the power of my own choice. It was a tragic, terrible choice, but it was mine. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath of the salt, thick air, and stepped forward. There was a moment of weightlessness, a terrifying, exhilarating second where the cage finally fell away. And then, there was only the blue, the infinite, silent, peaceful blue. Final chapter, the awakening of Tia. The raw, powerful waves of the Lover's Leap cliffside faded, their terrifying roar replaced by a steady, synthetic hum. The vibrant, chaotic dream was instantly gone. Tia gasped, her eyes snapping open in the disorienting semi-darkness of her black G-Wagon still parked in a dynamic, rugged Jamaican South Coast location. Through the passenger window, a wild, distorted face was staring at her, tapping incessantly with gnarled knuckles on the wet glass. He was ragged, wild-eyed, and muttering incoherently, a madman. Woman! Woman, wake up! What you doing here? The sea, the cliff! He wasn't a threat, he was a catalyst. His erratic knocking had pulled her from the tragic, liberating loop. Tia stared at him, her chest heaving, a sudden, powerful realization flooding her. The madman had seen, he knew. It wasn't real, she whispered, her voice stronger than it had been in years. She had been trapped not just by Anthony, but by the tragedy of her own mind. A new clarity defined her. She didn't fear the madman, nor did she need to jump. Her resolve, now unburdened by the cliff, settled into a deep, purposeful strength. She shifted the massive SUV into drive, giving the madman a steady nod of gratitude as she pulled away, leaving the rugged south coast behind for the final time. The G-Wagon, now a symbol of her agency, moved with purpose. She drove back to Kingston. She didn't return to the mansion as Anthony's wife, but as Shane's mother. She navigated the driveway of the expansive, white-walled Sterling mansion under bright morning light. The bougainvillea was vibrant, and for the first time Tia saw its beauty, not just the luxury it masked. Winston stood aside, his initial surprise at her return replaced by a subtle, supportive nod as she drove herself up the steps. Inside, the massive floor-to-ceiling mirrors reflected not a hollowed-out void, but a determined woman who had faced the edge and chosen life. The complex, abstract art no longer represented fractured isolation, but the resilient, creative energy she would reclaim. Shane, now awake and happy, was in his nursery, not empty but vibrant. Tia held him close, but her eyes, now steady and strong as she had practiced at the cliff, were steady and powerful. The framed wedding photos on the dresser were still there, but they no longer held her captive. They were just memories of an older life. Later that week, Tia walked into a small, sun-dappled community center. She had joined the Rising Tide, a local Kingston women's support group, a group of diverse Black Jamaican women, radiating professional confidence and distinct, powerful energy welcomed her. They weren't polished dolls or victims. They were survivors. Seated in a circle, bathed in bright morning light, Tia, holding Shane on her hip, spoke for the first time in a circle. Her voice, once weak and strained, was now clear, strong, and unwavering, echoing the defiance she had finally found. "I was on the edge," she said, looking around the supportive circle. "I was drowning in silence. A man who I thought was mad woke me. He showed me the difference between a dream and a choice. Today, I am making a choice. I am reclaiming my life. For me, for my son. My wrist is bare," she glanced down, "and it will stay that way. Until I place a bracelet of my own choice upon it." The women in the group nodded, a collective, powerful energy filling the room. In that bright morning circle, under the vast Jamaican sky, Tia was finally not alone. She had found a new, authentic, powerful life, a quiet, resolute triumph. The final step was not off the cliff, but back into the circle of shared strength. The story was over, and Tia's real life had finally begun.